In the years that followed 1870, when the days moved slowly and the seasons changed with a gentle predictability, the kitchens of American homes held a particular kind of quietness, a steadiness that came from doing the same tasks in the same way, day after day, with hands that knew the weight of a wooden spoon and the coolness of a ceramic bowl. The morning light would come through the kitchen window in a soft way, neither bright nor dim, just a gentle grayness that slowly turned to pale yellow as the sun found its place above the horizon. And in that light, a woman might stand at her kitchen table, her hands resting on the smooth wooden surface that had been worn down over years of preparing meals, the grain of the wood visible and familiar under her fingertips. The stove, a cast iron structure that stood solidly against the wall, would need to be tended first, and this was done slowly, methodically, with small pieces of kindling arranged in the firebox in a careful way, then slightly larger pieces of wood placed on top, and finally a match struck with a soft scratch against the rough side of the box, the flame touching the paper that had been crumpled and tucked beneath the wood. And then the waiting as the fire began to take hold, small wisps of smoke curling upward before the flames found their strength. While the stove warmed, which took some time, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes on a cool morning, there was the task of gathering what would be needed for breakfast. And this meant walking to the pantry, a small room or large cupboard where dry goods were kept in various containers, some made of tin, others of thick glass, and a few still stored in the cloth sacks they had arrived in from the general store in town. The oats for morning porridge were kept in a large tin container with a lid that fit snugly, and lifting this container required both hands, as it was heavy with the weight of many breakfast meals not yet prepared, and setting it on the kitchen table made a soft thudding sound, a gentle noise that seemed to belong to the early morning quiet. Measuring the oats was done with a tin cup that had been used for this purpose for so long that it had become slightly dented on one side, though this did not affect its usefulness, and the oats would be poured from the cup into a pot, making a soft, rushing sound like sand falling, and then the cup would be used twice more, so that there were 3 cups of oats in the pot, enough for a family of 5 or 6 people, with perhaps a little left over for someone who might want a second helping. Water came from the pump in the kitchen, if the house had indoor plumbing, which was becoming more common in the years after 1870, though many homes still required someone to walk outside to the well, and the pump handle would be worked up and down with a steady rhythm, creating a squeaking sound that was regular and somehow restful, and the water would splash into a large pitcher, clear and cold, and when the pitcher was full, it would be carried carefully to the stove, which by now would have warmed enough to begin cooking. The water was poured into the pot with the oats, and a pinch of salt was added from the salt cellar, which sat on a shelf near the stove where it could be easily reached, and the pot was placed on the flat surface of the stovetop, where it would sit for the next 30 or 40 minutes, needing to be stirred occasionally with a long wooden spoon that had a handle worn smooth from years of holding. While the porridge cooked, there was time to set the table, and this was done in the same way each morning, with each person's place arranged just so, a bowl for the porridge, a spoon placed to the right of the bowl, a cup for milk or water, and perhaps a small plate for bread if there was any bread, which was usually baked twice a week and kept wrapped in a clean cloth in the bread box. The bread box was made of tin, painted a cream color that had faded slightly over time, and it had a lid that rolled up and back, making a gentle rattling sound as it moved along its tracks, and inside, the bread would be sitting on a wooden board, the loaf already cut into slices, the knife resting beside it. And taking out enough slices for the family meant counting them carefully, making sure there was one for each person, and perhaps cutting more from the loaf if needed. Some families spread their bread with butter, which was kept in a butter dish with a glass cover. The butter pressed into the dish in a smooth mound, and the butter was often slightly soft by morning if the kitchen had retained any warmth from the previous day's cooking. Though in winter it would be quite firm and would need to be set near the stove to soften just a little before it could be spread easily. Other families preferred to save their butter for other meals, and would eat their bread plain with their porridge, or perhaps with a small amount of molasses drizzled on top, the dark syrup moving slowly from the spout of the molasses jug, a thick stream that fell in a neat line and pooled on the surface of the bread before slowly soaking in. The porridge would need attention now, and stirring it meant standing at the stove and moving the wooden spoon through the thickening mixture in slow circles, the spoon scraping along the bottom of the pot to prevent any sticking, and the steam rising from the pot would be warm against the face, carrying the simple, plain smell of cooked oats. A smell that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply familiar. A smell that meant morning and routine and the beginning of another day. When the porridge had cooked long enough, which could be determined by its thickness and the way it held together on the spoon rather than running off in a watery stream, it would be ladled into the bowls that had been set at each place at the table, and the ladle, a deep metal spoon with a long handle, would dip into the pot and come up full, and the porridge would slide into each bowl with a soft sound, and each portion would be roughly the same size, though no one measured exactly, as the practice of serving had made the portions automatic, something done by feel and habit rather than conscious thought. The family would gather, then, coming to the table from various parts of the house, the children rubbing sleep from their eyes, the father perhaps having already been outside to tend to morning chores if there were animals to feed or other farm work to be done, and they would sit in their usual places, which never changed from one day to the next, each person in the same chair at the same spot, facing the same direction as they had sat for years. Eating the porridge was a quiet activity, spoons moving from bowl to mouth in a steady rhythm, the only sounds being the soft clink of metal against ceramic and the occasional swallow or breath. And sometimes someone might reach for the pitcher of milk that sat in the center of the table and pour a little into their bowl, watching the white liquid spread across the surface of the porridge, turning the gray oats a lighter color, and perhaps adding a small spoon of sugar, if sugar was available, and if the family's practice was to use it at breakfast. After breakfast, the dishes would need to be cleared and washed, and this task often fell to the same person each day. Or perhaps it was shared among the older children, taking turns week by week, and the dishes would be carried from the table to the dry sink, which was a wooden counter with a metal or ceramic basin set into it, and here the washing would take place. Water for washing had to be heated, and this meant filling a kettle and setting it on the stove earlier in the morning, or perhaps using some of the hot water that remained from cooking the porridge, pouring it into the basin and adding cold water from the pump until the temperature was right, warm enough to cut through any residue on the dishes, but not so hot as to be uncomfortable for the hands. Soap was usually homemade, cut from large blocks into smaller pieces that could be used for washing, and a piece of soap would be held under the water, rubbed between the hands until a lather formed, and then the dishes would be washed one by one, the bowl, the spoon, the cup, each one scrubbed with a cloth that had been designated for this purpose. The cloth moving in circles over the surface of the dish, and then the dish would be rinsed in a separate basin of clean water and set on a wooden drying rack to air dry, the water dripping slowly from the dishes and running down into a shallow tray beneath the rack. The morning would continue with other tasks, and in homes where there were many mouths to feed, the thinking about the midday meal would begin not long after breakfast was finished, as preparing food took time and planning, and the midday meal, sometimes called dinner in these years, was often the largest meal of the day, requiring more preparation than breakfast or the evening supper. A typical midday meal might include boiled potatoes, which were a staple in many American homes after 1870, as they were inexpensive, filling, and could be stored for long periods in a cool, dark place like a cellar. And preparing potatoes meant first going down to the cellar, which was reached by a narrow stairway or sometimes an outside entrance, and the cellar would be cool and dim, with a smell of earth and storage, and the potatoes would be kept in wooden bins or burlap sacks, their surfaces dusty and sometimes sprouted with small white growths that would need to be cut away. Selecting potatoes for the meal meant looking through the bin and choosing ones that were firm and not too large, as very large potatoes took longer to cook, and the potatoes would be placed in a basket or apron pocket and carried back up to the kitchen, where they would be set on the counter to be prepared. Preparing potatoes involved scrubbing them clean as they came from the cellar covered in bits of soil and dust, and this was done at the dry sink, holding each potato under the cold water from the pump and scrubbing with a rough brush, the water turning brown with the dirt that washed away. And then the potato would be set aside and the next one picked up, the process repeated until all the potatoes were clean. Some cooks peeled their potatoes before boiling, using a small sharp knife to remove the skin in long strips that would fall into a bowl or bucket to be discarded later, perhaps thrown to chickens if the family kept chickens, or added to a compost heap. And peeling potatoes was a task that took time but did not require much thought, the hands working automatically while the mind wandered to other things, other tasks that would need to be done that day or that week. Other cooks left the skins on, especially if the potatoes were young and fresh, as the skin added flavor and nutrients, though this was not something that was much discussed in those years, nutrition being a less developed science than it would later become, and the decision to peel or not to peel was often simply a matter of habit or family preference, passed down from mother to daughter without much explanation. The clean potatoes would be placed in a large pot, covered with water from the pump, and set on the stove to boil, and the stove would need to be tended again. More would added to keep the fire burning at the right temperature, not too hot, as that would cause the water to boil too vigorously and the potatoes to break apart, but hot enough to maintain a steady bubbling, the water moving in gentle waves around the potatoes as they softened. While the potatoes cooked, which took perhaps 30 or 40 minutes depending on their size, there might be other components of the meal to prepare, perhaps a vegetable from the garden if it was summer or fall, or from the preserved stores if it was winter or spring, and if it was summer, there might be green beans to be snapped and trimmed, which was done sitting at the kitchen table, a large bowl in the lap, and a basket of beans beside the chair. Snapping beans meant taking each bean between the fingers, bending it until it broke with a soft snap, removing the ends and pulling away any tough strings that ran along the sides. And the prepared beans would fall into the bowl, and the ends and strings would go into a scrap bowl. And this task could be done while listening to the sounds of the house, the ticking of a clock on the wall, the crackling of the fire in the stove, perhaps voices from another room where someone was engaged in a different task. The beans, once prepared, would be added to a pot with a little water and a small piece of salt pork or bacon if the family had it, as this added flavor to the beans, and the pot would be set on the stove alongside the potatoes, both cooking at the same time, the kitchen filling with steam and the mingled smells of cooking food. Simple smells that were neither strong nor particularly appetizing, just the ordinary smells of plain home cooking. In winter, the vegetables might come from jars that had been preserved in the late summer, jars of green beans or tomatoes or corn, all processed and sealed during the busy canning season when the garden was producing more than could be eaten fresh. And opening a jar of preserved vegetables meant first checking the seal to make sure it was still good, looking for any signs that air had entered the jar or that the contents had spoiled, though if the canning had been done properly, this was rare. The jar would be opened by prying up the metal lid with a knife or a special tool designed for the purpose, and there would be a soft pop as the seal broke. And then the lid could be lifted off and the contents poured into a pot to be heated. As preserved vegetables were already cooked during the canning process and only needed to be warmed through before serving. If there was to be meat with the midday meal, it might be a piece of salt pork, sliced thin and fried in a skillet until it was crisp and browned, the fat rendering out and pooling in the bottom of the skillet, and this fat might be saved and used for cooking other things later, poured into a tin cup and allowed to cool and solidify, stored in a cool place until it was needed again. Or the meat might be left over from a previous meal, perhaps a piece of roasted chicken or a slice of ham, which would be cut into smaller pieces and warmed in the skillet with a little water to keep it from drying out, the water sizzling when it hit the hot pan and then settling into a gentle simmer as the meat warmed through. Some families, especially those in rural areas or those with limited means, had meat only occasionally, and their meals were built around starches like potatoes and breads, and legumes like beans, and any vegetables they could grow or preserve, and these meals were filling and adequate, if not exciting, and were eaten with the same regularity and routine as meals in more prosperous households. Setting the table for the midday meal was much like setting it for breakfast, except that plates were used instead of bowls, as the food would be served in separate portions rather than as a porridge, and forks were added to the spoons, and sometimes knives if there was meat that needed to be cut, and the table might be covered with a cloth, though in many homes the bare wood of the table was simply wiped clean between meals and used without covering. Serving the meal meant bringing the pots from the stove to the table, using thick cloths to protect the hands from the hot handles, and setting the pots on trivets or folded cloths so they would not scorch the table, and then using serving spoons to portion out the food onto each person's plate, the potatoes steaming as they were lifted from their pot, the beans glistening with the fat from the salt pork, and perhaps a slice of bread on the side, and a cup of water or milk to drink. The meal would be eaten in the same quiet way as breakfast, with conversation perhaps a bit more present, as the morning's work had loosened tongues and there might be things to discuss, though the talk was usually of ordinary matters, what needed to be done that afternoon. What tasks were completed in the morning? Small observations about the weather or the condition of the garden, or news from a neighbor, all discussed in low, even tones that did not disturb the steady rhythm of eating. After the midday meal, the dishes would again need to be cleared and washed, the process identical to the one followed after breakfast. The water heated, the soap lathered, the dishes scrubbed and rinsed and set to dry, and the leftovers, if there were any, would be covered with a cloth and set in a cool place, perhaps in the cellar if the weather was warm, or simply left on the counter if the weather was cool enough that the food would not spoil before the evening meal. The afternoon would be filled with other tasks, and the kitchen might be quiet for a while, used only for the occasional cup of tea or glass of water. Someone passing through on their way to some other part of the house or to go outside, and the stove fire might be allowed to die down if the weather was warm, or fed occasionally with small pieces of wood if the house needed the heat. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, thoughts would turn to supper, which was a lighter meal than the midday dinner, often consisting of whatever had been left from dinner, reheated and perhaps supplemented with bread and butter, or a simple soup made from vegetables and perhaps a bit of meat or bone broth if there was any. Making soup was an economical way to use up odds and ends, and a soup pot might be brought out and set on the stove, and into it would go various things: a potato or two, cut into small cubes, a carrot if there was one, sliced thin, an onion, chopped fine, and any leftover vegetables from previous meals, and water would be added, and perhaps a bone that had been saved from a roast. The bone giving flavor to the water as the soup cooked slowly for an hour or more. The soup would bubble gently on the back of the stove, filling the kitchen with a plain, pleasant smell, and occasionally someone would stir it, check its progress, taste a spoonful to see if it needed salt, and when it was done, it would be ladled into bowls and served with bread, and this would be the evening meal, simple and warm and satisfying in its own quiet way. Evening tasks in the kitchen included tidying up, washing the supper dishes, wiping down the counter and table, sweeping the floor with a broom made of bound straw, the bristles making a soft swishing sound as they moved across the wooden boards, collecting crumbs and bits of food that had fallen during the day's cooking and eating, and the crumbs would be swept into a dustpan and thrown outside for the birds or chickens. The stove would be allowed to go cold, unless the weather was very cold and the stove was needed for heat through the night, and in that case it would be banked. The fire reduced to coals and covered with ash to keep it smoldering slowly until morning, when it could be built up again. The kitchen, once all the evening work was done, would settle into a deeper quiet, the lamps perhaps still burning if there was reading or mending to be done at the kitchen table, the light casting soft shadows on the walls, the house around the kitchen settling as well, everyone moving toward their beds, the day's routines completed, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same tasks again, the same rhythms, the same simple meals prepared in the same simple ways, and there was a comfort in this sameness, a steadiness that made life feel manageable and calm, each day very much like the one before it, the seasons changing slowly, the years passing with a gentlest at the center of it all, a place of work and worry and quietades, where food did teakings, and where the simplest of newest of two with chaos to simplest ends, and with the simple, and with the simplest end, we get poet, and we can it, and it is but at it, but with you at a curb, by a curb, but put to a guy where I could, but way out, but if it had, but you of you put I put you, I but yeah, we are with the boy, where I'm if you with us, would you if I'm a fool to do me? I was would depend with super being butterfly. But if we walked the way all the fight, there's if you will, man. If I want to slow day after day after day, in the American homes of the years that followed,